Hey everybody, this is Mr. Mobman coming back at you again with another APGov video. Once again, I'm taking a look at topic 5.1, voting rights and models of voting behavior. Last time we were talking about the history of the expansion of voting rights in America from a very small select of white male landowning individuals that were over the age of 21, and in some places had to be of the right religious affiliation, to by the time we get into the mid-1960s, at least on paper, everybody over the age of 21 was protected in terms of being able to vote. But of course, that's on paper. We mentioned previously that even though the 15th Amendment had been on the books since 1870, we had seen a number of ways that state southern legislatures had, in reality, denied black Americans the right to vote through things like literacy tests and poll taxes, just to name a couple. Now, a very, very important turning point in bringing what were rights on paper into reality will be the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Now, what the Voting Rights Act of 1965 does is right off the bat ban literacy tests. We mentioned that previously. But here's the bigger, I think, more important component of it. It states that because these southern states that had a history of segregation and discrimination against black Americans in terms of access to voting rights, since these states really had such a poor history of protecting those rights, the federal government was pretty much saying at this point that they couldn't trust them to be able to actually govern themselves in terms of running their own elections and making rules for themselves, etc., etc. So what's going to be included in this law is something known as the pre-clearance requirement. And what the pre-clearance requirement stipulates is that if you are a state that has a history of Jim Crow segregation and discrimination, even though states have the power to determine their own election laws, in this case, if you're one of these types of states that's being mentioned here, you will have to have any changes you want to make done approved by the Justice Department, the U.S. Department of Justice, led by the Attorney General. And so that's going to be a very significant way to help make sure that the Voting Rights Act is going to be properly implemented and that southern states can't continue to find ways to get around the spirit of this legislation. Now, this will go a long way in actually making, the 15th Amendment a reality, not just something on paper. Now, fast forward, well over almost 50 years to the case of Shelby County versus Holder. What this was focusing in is on the county of Shelby County, North Carolina, filing a lawsuit wanting to be able to do away with the pre-clearance provision. And the Supreme Court, by this point in time, has a much more conservative lean to it than it did back in the 1960s. This more modern Supreme Court is going to side with Shelby County and will undo the pre-clearance provision. The basic argument behind it is that, over the last 50 years approximately, racial attitudes had changed significantly, and that there would be, no real concerted effort to try to go back to a, pre-Voting Rights Act set of legislation in the future. Now, that has led to some controversy because we have seen southern states now, with that freedom to be able to have their own voting laws without any approval by the U.S. Department of Justice, start to make changes that we have seen have made it harder for people in urban areas, for example, to be able to vote early, to have a proper proportional number of precincts per person. In other words, things that tend to have a disadvantageous opportunity for people of color to be able to effectively vote since then. So it is a really controversial issue in terms of protecting states' rights to be able to vote, which is significant and important, but also making sure that the Voting Rights Act and the spirit of the 15th Amendment is properly implemented. And then the most significant recent expansion of democracy is going to come during the Vietnam War era, with the 26th Amendment being ratified in 1971, which lowers the voting age down to 18. Now, I mentioned this being of the Vietnam War era because the Vietnam War is going to play a critical role in why this amendment was ratified. You got to remember that back during when the Vietnam War started, you could be drafted at age 18 and sent to go fight and die in Southeast Asia, but not legally be able to vote until 21, which meant that you could be drafted, sent to go die, in another country, based on decisions of people that you had no choice in voting for. That seemed, pretty anti-small d democratic. So this was the rationale to lower that age. So basically, if you're old enough to fight and die for your country in the military, you're old enough to be able to vote. All right, so stepping away from the history of suffrage rights in America, let's now take a look at some voting behaviors. What we're going to be taking a look at here are models for how we vote. And that's going to be very important. It kind of gets into some of the psychology of how we go about voting and what is an impact. One way that we are, possibly impacted to vote is through what we call rational choice voting. And as the name implies, it's a very straightforward way of, kind of doing your pros and cons list about particular candidates. And, going in there and making the best logical decision. And to be able to do that effectively, you got to do your homework. You got to be able to actually know who these candidates are. You got to know what their values are. You got to know how they voted in the past. If you're talking about, whether, a candidate's support or lack of support for a particular issue, you better know what that issue is about. So, many, for example, founding fathers would probably say, hey, you should be rationally voting. And I think most people would probably say on the surface that, yeah, you should be rationally voting. But it does ask a lot of people, especially people that are busy. They have to work. They have children to raise. They have lives to live. And, nothing says in our Constitution that you have to be, a political science junkie to be able to vote. And most people are not political science junkies. So it might be, we talk about rational choice voting. Yes, there are people that do that. But many people don't. And there's a reason why, because it's hard. It takes time and it takes interest, and most Americans just don't really have either. Now, in addition to that, we are also impacted by what we call retrospective voting. And as that name, implies, retro, that prefix meaning going back, it's basically, looking at a candidate. And what we're usually looking at here are incumbents, someone that is already in office, usually seeking re-election. And we take a look at how this person's already done in the job or how they've done in previous jobs. So you don't necessarily have to be an incumbent. You could be a challenger. But let's say you're running for president as a challenger, but you are currently the governor of North Carolina or something. You would be looking at how that person's done in that most recent job. So, let's say, for example, President Biden's running for re-election in 2024. A retrospective voter is going to look back and go, okay, how did Joe Biden do in his term in office so far? And if there's a feeling that, yes, Biden's done a good job, well, then that's going to lead that voter to vote to re-elect Biden. If that voter looks back at Biden's term and goes, no, I don't think he's done a very good job, well, then that's going to make it likely that that voter is going to vote for the challenger or some other candidate on the ballot. Conversely, you also have what's called prospective voting. And once again, you look at the prefix there, pro, that means moving forward. And so the idea being is you're not necessarily looking at a candidate's past performance. You're looking at the message of what this candidate is promising and determining whether you like that promise or you like that plan or not. For example, in 1932, Franklin Roosevelt ran for president on a promise to bring a, quote, New Deal to the American people. And he promised to have more government intervention to help people during the Great Depression. Now, note, Roosevelt made it a point not to get super detailed in what this New Deal really looks like. He didn't mention anything like FDIC, and he didn't mention the TVA or the AAA or any of the other, litany of alphabet soup programs that will come out of the New Deal eventually. But he gave a general sense of what it was. And at a time where Americans were broke and desperate, the idea of a new plan, something that is going to involve government action that we hadn't seen before, it seemed very exciting. In 1980, when Ronald Reagan runs for president, he's running on a message of, bringing America back to a sense of pride and patriotism. You got to remember the 1970s was a pretty rough decade for the United States, both foreign and domestically. At a time where we had really high inflation, high interest rates, unemployment levels were not very good. We had just gotten, our butts kicked in Vietnam. We'd had the Watergate scandal. Ford was a klutzy president. Carter was seen as weak with the Iran hostage, incident. And so there was just a sense that America had really lost its mojo along the way. And what Reagan's promising in 1980 is a sense of, no, we are a great country. We need to be waving our flag. We need to be proud of who we are. He's got a plan to, implement, trickle-down economics, reduction in taxes, a bigger, bolder military to stand up to the Soviet Union and communism. And so people were excited about that. And Reagan wins very easily in 1980. So you look at the messaging, and that's what's going to determine whether you like that idea or not. And so, for example, in 2024, see who's going to be challenging President Biden. Now, if it's Donald Trump again, well, you may not have too much prospective voting because both of these guys had been president before. But if it's somebody new, like say Ron DeSantis out of Florida, let's say he has a new, fresh message, well, that might be how some people vote based on that kind of a prospective voting model. Something that is very historically a way that dictates how we vote is through what we call party line voting. Party line voting, as the name implies, is simply looking at one of two things. Is there an R or is there a D next to that candidate's name? Are they a Republican or are they a Democrat? And that's pretty much it. Historically, this was a very, very, very big influence on how people voted. There were, this, and especially if you go back 100 plus years and you talk about the age of political machines and party bosses and all that kind of stuff. And back when political parties provided basic services, like fire protection and, treatment of wastewater and all that kind of stuff, you looked to the party. The candidate didn't really matter. It was the party, and there was intense party loyalty. And we've seen that diminish in the last 50 years or so, but it's still a pretty powerful impact. There are a lot of folks that, for example, if you ask them, like, could you ever see yourself voting for a Republican? They'd say, absolutely not. Or if you ask some people, like, could you ever see yourself voting for a Democrat? And you have folks that would say, absolutely not. So that can drive still a lot of party loyalty. It's not as strong as it used to be, but it's still pretty noticeable, still pretty impactful. Some other things that, impact how people tend to vote, especially if you're talking about, like national elections and things like that, is a candidate's personality. Do you have a fun personality that you can connect to the average American? There's what they kind of call the beer test. The idea is, is this somebody that you like to sit down and have a beer with, so to speak? Is there someone that you just kind of like as a person? For a lot of voters, George W. Bush seemed like that kind of guy. Even though he comes from a very wealthy, established family, he had a very folksy appeal to himself that a lot of people resonated with. There was, Bill Clinton in the 1990s that was very popular because he seemed to emotionally connect with people. His famous, I feel your pain, statement in 1992, plays a big role. I remember as a teenager, him on MTV, the first candidate for president that went on MTV, trying to win over college votes and going on late night television, playing his saxophone, wearing sunglasses, So, that personality is important. And then also for many folks, at the end of the day, when they're voting for, an office, particularly if it's president of the United States, a lot of folks are just looking at, a particular issue that really moves them. There are many Americans, for example, that they're just focused on gun policy. Are you the candidate that's in line with their values on gun policy, be it, more gun liberty or more gun control or whatever? A lot of folks, that issue is abortion. For some folks, it is LGBT rights. For some, it's taxation. For some, it's, issues with immigration and border security. But there are many Americans that they base their entire vote on which candidate is in line with that one particular issue. And I would say with many Americans nationally, probably, if you are a single issue voter, it's probably based on abortion or guns as being that driving factor. Okay, we'll leave it there for now. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.